This car's here for a very specific reason, and it's right under your nose. Can you guess why? Did you guess right? This vehicle has a torn or ripped CV boot on the passenger side. Now that's flinging grease all over the place, all over the caliper, the hose, and the shock, and the most obvious is on the wheel. This has been happening for a while. You can actually see grease on the outside of the wheel. So if you're looking at your vehicle from the outside and you happen to see grease there, that might be one of the issues that you're having. Now this vehicle is not showing any symptoms other than grease flinging everywhere. If we let this go for a while, eventually we're going to get a clicking noise when turning back and forth, or if it goes a longer time, it's going to be binding up and cause a shake in the steering or even a vibration down the road. Before we let it get to that point, we're going to replace it with this CV shaft from 1AAuto.com. Let's get into it. All vehicles are a little bit different, but when replacing CV shafts, it's very similar. You're going to take the tire off, the axle nut, but then you need to move the knuckle outwards, so you're going to either have to drop the lower suspension down or raise up on the shock or strut and get that out of the way. So for this vehicle, we're going to drop the lower suspension down. We're going to take this nut off next. Before we go any further, you can actually see how much grease is on the backing shield, and that's important to know. That's why it's good to have those backing shields in good shape. You don't want any of that grease getting on the rotor. That's going to compromise your braking. It could be a serious safety concern. I'm going to separate the ball joint from the knuckle. I'm going to give the knuckle a little tap with a hammer. You could use a pickle fork, but you run into the problem that you could rip the boot, and I don't want to rip the boot, so I'm just going to give a little pressure here and give this a tap. There we go. Now push the knuckle out and then pull the axle out. Now we need to pop the inboard side of the axle out. In this vehicle, it happens to be in a differential. Most vehicles, you're going to have the transmission or even a transfer case to pop it out. You can use a tool like this that looks like a fork. This is an axle fork. I'm going to slide it in between the axle and where the differential is, and then pushing it up, it's just going to split it. It is wedged, so it's going to push it out. That'll pop it out. Sometimes you want to use a pry bar. In our case, we're actually going to use a long punch and just give it a tap. And it's starting to move. I do have a drain bucket underneath because we might lose some fluid. And there it is. Before we put the new axle in, I am going to just take a rag and clean up all the area where the grease was flinging on any of the brake caliper. Make sure it didn't get on the brake rotor. Just do the best you can. You don't want someone else thinking that they have a bad CV shaft or that you have a bad CV shaft and it's just residual that was just left there. Now we're going to install the new one the same way the old one came out. Slide it in place, give it a little twist. And if you can just push it in, that's the best way to do it. Slide that through the wheel bearing and the knuckle. Might have to twist it a little bit. Now we're going to put the ball joint in, and I'm using a pull jack to raise this up. Before I raise the ball joint to the point of the knuckle, I'm going to put the nut on. Otherwise, sometimes you can't get the nut on if it's all the way up. Slide that in position. Then you're going to want to torque that nut to manufacturer's specs. Every vehicle is a little bit different. And most of the time you can't really get a torque wrench in there, so do the best you can. That's good. Lower the pull jack down and out of the way. If any fluid leaked out while you have the axle out, you're going to want to top that off if it's in the transmission or if it's in the front differential. Now we're going to put the axle nut on and torque it. Torque on the axle nut is very important. If you don't torque it properly, you're going to mess up your wheel bearing, and then you're going to be doing another job in the future. With the vehicle lower to the ground, now I can torque the spindle nut or axle nut. I'm just using a pry bar going in between the two lugs that I put right there. That way this is not going to spin, and that's against the ground. And I can torque this to spec. If you have any spray of grease on the inner fender well, you want to just clean that up real quick. Just use a rag and some brake parts cleaner. Before you put the wheel back on, you definitely want to clean all this grease up. So we'll just use some brake parts cleaner and wipe it down. You really don't want to use brake parts cleaner on the front of the wheel where the nice surface is, but you can do it on the back of the wheel. This is so thick on here, I'm actually going to use a scraper and just scrape it off. And look at that, it's all cleaned up, ready to go. And put the tire on. Torquing the wheel on, you always want to do a cross pattern so that you tighten the wheel down evenly. And just make sure you torque it to the proper torque spec. And I always go around and double check. Just make sure they're all torqued properly. There we go. Overall, replacing a CV shaft isn't that hard to do. It's something you can do in your driveway. There's not much you can do to prevent a CV shaft from ripping or tearing open. The rubber breaks down and the elements from the road. So you may not even know that you have a ripped CV boot, so go out and check. And if you need a CV joint, you can get yours at oneauto.com. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you subscribe to our channel, ring the bell, turn on all notifications so don't miss any of our videos. Torquing the wheel, Torquing the wheel, you always want to start with one lug. Jeez, it's like I've never done this before.